He's author of 5 books on conflict and media. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, at the very outset, thanks for inviting me to speak on transmedia storytelling. There are stories which are told in forms of journalistic output, and there are stories which are told in terms of fiction, and those formats are essentially different. It was wonderful listening to Professor John Butcher, very thought provoking. I, of course, listened to the last bit of his presentation, but I will, as a professional journalist, I will try to insist that I stick to the mass media journalistic realm of storytelling and talk about transmedia storytelling within this ambit. I will keep out things like films and science fiction and stuff like that, because that's not my forte. I have not done any fiction. I started writing some spy stories recently in my mother tongue, Bangla, based on actual experiences, but I've not gone very far on that. So I'll basically stick to the mass media journalism ambit. But there is a huge world as far as transmedia storytelling is concerned within the ambit of journalism and mass media. I will also bring to bear here the aspect of language, because I have myself been a multimedial journalist and a multilingual journalist. And I've seen how, like the shard theory, it makes a lot of sense here. There may be some essential reality. When the glass jar exists, it's perhaps the essential reality. When it falls and breaks into 1,000 pieces, then the question of mosaic that John was talking about and how you weave that mosaic, that's actually the storytelling bit of it. And that varies depending on where you are and what your canvas is. Yeah. So that depends on your target audience, the audience that you are trying to aim your story at, because you don't try to tell the story in the same way if your audience is a world audience. So when I'm broadcasting for BBC World, the very same story will be put out in a different way, which seeks to make sense to a listener in US, UK, Russia, India, wherever, so long as they understand the language that I'm broadcasting in. But when I'm trying to broadcast the same story in a particular language, and I did that in BBC for years, 17 years, the same story which I broadcast in English for a world audience, BBC World Service, immediately when the request comes, we have heard your story, ABC, whatever it is, we need this for the BBC Bengali service. Immediately the angles change. Immediately my priorities change. What I go on top may differ from what was the case in the BBC World Service story put out in English. So in this BBC Hindi service, again, the angle changes, and Urdu service, and Nepali, and Burmese. Every service that I would broadcast, there would be a certain amount of tweak to suit the taste and the demand of the audience. Because over a period of time, and this is where, lies the difference between success and failure as a multimedial, multilingual broadcaster. When you do transmedia storytelling to different audiences, you aim your stories, is that you must have a pretty good understanding about your audience. The audience, the area that they live in, the language that they essentially speak in, the culture that they essentially come from, and what they expect out of a certain story which may have global resonance. Unless this subtle understanding, and this is something that can't be taught, Yeah, this is not something that BBC, a World Service newsroom, will teach me, because they taught me the basics of journalism, broadcast journalism to be precise, and I would broadcast in radio, television, and finally online as well. This is something you pick up as you go ahead. I agree with John that when you do transmedia storytelling, you should be in command of the media that you initially hail from. But what happens to someone like me who started his career in news agency journalism with PTI and then went over to newspaper, the print media, then again news media, news agency like Reuters, and then in BBC, radio to begin with, and then television, and finally online. Long journey. Every single medium, you know, there is an essential story, of course, but the way of telling it in different media sharply varies. And what you look for, the elements that you look for to tell the same story in different media varies huge, varies hugely. So when you do that story for news agency or print, say for instance a story on arsenic poisoning in Bengal, the first thing you're looking for is to speak to a lot of people and gather, how this whole sort of problem has played out. In radio, the first thing, because you tell a story through sounds, is to perhaps get the sound bite of the pumping of a tube well so that you play that sound and you say, well, these tube wells in Bengal spews not water but poison, because what comes out in the shape of water contains an unacceptable level of arsenic, which leads to huge amount of health problems. But you need that sound bite of the, so that you bring the audience and transport the audience to the village of Bengal, where this water comes through a tube well which you pump in. The tube well is something that may be typical of this place, not quite always, because when I was a fellow in Germany and I went to a village called Spock on the German-Austrian border, I found tube wells there as well. But maybe people will understand that, the main source of water in these villages are the tube well which you pump in, and this makes a certain kind of noise. And that's how you tell the story. Of course, in television, you would get your camera has to do the trick, because if you don't have visuals, you don't have a story in television. And therefore, you got to get visuals of a similar kind. The villagers pumping the tube well, water coming out, and then of course you go to the arsenic patients, who some of whom have skin discoloration, disfiguring of skin, and stuff like that. And then you get bites, and you develop your story. You build up the whole story. The point I'm trying to make here is there is an essential story. Here is a medical problem, and the problem originates from the kind of water that you are drinking. That's the essential story. That's the glass jar. But then you drop the jar and the pieces you pick up and you paint the mosaic, the structuring of that mosaic, the structuring, I insist on the word structuring of that mosaic, which a smart craftsman, the storyteller, does, very much depends on the elements that goes on to make a particular kind of media. And your effectiveness as a transmedia storytelling has to do a lot, as John was right, with the understanding of the story. In the BBC, they said, unless you can write a clean top line, you don't know what the story is. You're going to be mixed up. You're going to be beating about the bush without actually getting on the story. So the trick of the trade and the litmus test of whether you have understood the story is to have the right kind of top line. What is the essential story? So the top line and then the first sort of lead paragraphs basically deals with what the story is, and that's something. But then that is the essence of the story. That's the glass jar before it falls and breaks. But then this reality, I'm quite impressed by that shard theory of John, is that then you work it round and play it round depending on what media you are reporting in, you are playing that story in. And that varies. The elements varies. The way you spin it up, it all varies. So the structuring of the mosaic, as I might say, depends A, on your understanding of the story, because that's the main thing. And then, of course, the requirements of the media, the elements that make particular media typically different from another media. So, um, and this also varies with the language that you are broadcasting in. The same Russia Ukraine story, when broadcast in a certain language, the priorities of the audience are essentially different. So, if you are broadcasting a Russia Ukraine story to an Indian or a South Asian audience, you're basically thinking at the very beginning that your audience is more interested in the fallout of the crisis rather than the nitty gritty of the day to day war that's taking place there. And they would be interested in stories like, I mean, who in Europe is so much interested in Indian medical students in Ukraine? But that's the top line story for us. So every newspaper, every television channel would run a main story, maybe, which deals with the war that's taking place there. But essentially, the big story is my boy stuck there. Yeah. So the priorities vary. One of the most important things, therefore, in this whole business of transmedia storytelling is the understanding of the media that you're broadcasting in. And here I will actually try to emphasize that all of us actually originate or come from a particular media. It's not that at the very beginning of your career, you were broadcasting for radio, television, online. No, that was not the case. You started off somewhere. I started off in a very small newspaper actually from the Northeast, which has gone out of circulation now. It was a English newspaper in Assam at the peak of the Assam agitation, the anti-foreigner agitation. The point I'm trying to make here is I learned this early on because then I moved on to PTI. I immediately realized that the focus of the story about this anti-foreigner agitation that one needed to have to report to an Assamese audience back home and the requirement of a transnational or trans-India agency like PTI entirely different. The focus was entirely different. And on that depended on what kind of quotes you got. So maybe the first quote you'd look for when you are reporting this story, uh, for an Assamese newspaper would be to go to Prafulla Kumar Mohanta, who was heading the ASU at that point of time and leading the agitation. But for the same story, when you did for PTI, the first man you tried to go to was Home Minister at that point of time, Zail Singh, later president, who was actually trying to mediate and negotiate a solution to the whole crisis from the government of India point of view. So that's how the focus changes. That's how the focus changes, and who gets how much space, how much importance, who goes on tops, who goes at the middle, and what goes at the end. It all depends on your audience that you're trying to address, the expanse of you know coverage that's expected of you in a particular media. In a regional media, it has to be tight and focused. But when it becomes national, it spreads. And if it's a global media, of course, the span is much more wider because you then need, as is the case in arithmetic, the highest common factor. So you need to look for, you know, uh, elements that will make sense and resonate with the audience over a wide geographical expanse. Now, having focused on the transmedia, the sort of transmedia storytelling as it differs from media to media, and also language to language, the focus is very, very different. And I realize this even in the fiction world. When you watch Netflix, the same Turkish filmmaker, when he makes a film, with the world audience in mind, and he's looking for, his film going to Cannes or Carlo Vivari, the focus is different. Even in the fiction, the ambit of fiction, feature film, when something is made purely for a Turkish audience, well, the focus, I'm afraid, is different. When you are focusing on, and one of the major difference here is that the bigger your audience get, you need to do a lot more backgrounding. You know why? Because you can't take certain things for granted. When you're broadcasting to a tight audience, I mean a focused regional audience, you take many things for granted. You expect your regional audience to know, an Assamese newspaper audience to know who is ASU and what it stands for. But when you are broadcasting to a national audience or an international audience, you have to say all Assam Students Union is not just a students' union, it's not just a student body. It has led from time to time the most powerful agitations, political agitations in the state of Assam, and rendered existing political parties irrelevant. It has taken center stage because this is not something that usually happens across the world. So if you say all Assam Students Union, and somebody in Britain will say, students, what the hell are they doing with this kind of an agitation? Because back in England, well, the students don't do that. Perhaps in France, sometimes we've seen in 1968 during the campus revolution, students taking a lead role in certain agitations for social change, but not so much in England. So if you have to tell a British audience, ASU, Assam, they're taking the lead in agitation, trying to throw out migrants, you got to do a lot of backgrounding, in the sense you got to bring in the context and explain certain things about this organization and other things. So that's one of the major requirements, that as your camera focus expands, the focus of your storytelling expands, and it goes from regional to national to global. You need to do, as you expand, you need to do a lot of backgrounding. You need to actually, which may seem redundant to a local audience. Assamese audience, they say, "Hey, iman kyon koi ase asu tasu loi? আমি না জানো না হ্যাঁ আমি জানো ASU বস্তুটা কি, we know what ASU stands for." But then when you are doing that for a global audience or even a national audience, you need to explain. So that's one of the important features of transmedia storytelling, is that when it becomes more expansive, it calls for more backgrounding, more contextualization, and putting the whole thing in the perspective. Because it's too much to expect that a listener in France or in Britain will understand the context of the importance of student unions in the politics of Northeast India. So you got to actually say things loud. That takes more time, that takes more space. And that's where the challenge comes in, because you are having to, focus. For a global audience, they will always tell you, as my studio managers in the BBC World Service would say, oh, you need to keep your dispatch to no more than a minute, max minute and quarter. So a minute, 15 seconds maximum. But you ought to say an awful lot in that, because you got to do a lot of backgrounding. Yeah, you can't take things for granted. In linguistic storytelling, I mean vernacular language storytelling, I found you get somewhat more space. Maybe the reason is that certain languages are very specific and less verbose. I would say that my own mother tongue is much more verbose than the language I usually used in my journalistic career, English. English is a language of understatement, but Indian languages, you need to be very much more explicit. অনেক বেশি বলতে টলতে হয়, এবং সেটা লোকে প্রত্যাশাও করে. People expect you to, be more descriptive, more narrative, not in English, because English is the language of understatement. It's a cultural problem. So these are the finer points that a multilingual, multimedial storyteller, a transmedia storyteller, has to grapple with. These are very big challenges. an understanding of the language that you are broadcasting in, because you may be broadcasting in 6 languages, as I did in the BBC. So for every single linguistic audience, you need to keep in mind who is listening to you. You got to think of the Chachaji in Bihar when you are broadcasting in BBC Hindi, and the Chacha in Bangladesh when you're broadcasting in Bangla, or somebody in West Bengal. You got to really, really think about your audience, what they expect, what is their level of understanding. So, for instance, you need to do more backgrounding when you are doing COVID stories for a regional audience, because you can expect somebody to understand more, have better understanding of COVID, not when it started, but after a while, you know, in say English language broadcasting. So you need to be more explicit, because at the grassroots level, Indian villages, you know, reality often becomes a victim of, I won't say fake news here, but a lot of wrong propaganda or wrong kind of rumors. Let me make it that clear. Rumors. So a lot of things flies around. But so you need to be more specific, and you need to attribute that this is said by men of authority. So who has said this, rather than just say and get away with it. So that's why sourcing and attribution becomes extremely important. Yeah. And therefore, I would actually. How much time do I have more? Do I have about 5 to 10 minutes more? Hello.
So you can continue for next 2 to 3 minutes.
Next what? 15 minutes, you said?
Yeah. 5 minutes is
Okay.
fine. 5 minutes is fine.
5 minutes. Okay. No problem. So I would, which means 5 minutes means it's time to wrap up. And it's part of my training to stick to time. So I would say that transmedia storytelling is not just a craft. It is a craft. The storytelling bit of it is an art, but the developing of the story is a science. It depends on hard research, adherence to facts. Facts are sacrosanct. Interpretations may vary, but facts are sacrosanct. And therefore, developing the story or basing the story, the way you build it up, the essential story, is as much science as art. The way to tell it is an art. And there, it's important whether, even when you are in a non-visual medium, there are people I've seen in radio whose dispatches are very, very graphic. You can actually visualize just listening to radio without seeing any visual, without seeing any camera work. There are people like Mark Tully who taught me broadcasting, Sir Mark Tully. Is that when you heard him on radio in the 1980s and 90s, before BBC turned to television, you could actually visualize the scenario, or the scene, rather, not the scenario, but the scene. When you heard him that was the skill. That was how built up the story, and maybe with a little bit of play of sound here and there. But in radio, sound is most important element. You build up a story with sound, and not just sound bites of people talking, because just people talking doesn't make good medium. You need some effects. So sound effects, very important in radio. Television, it's actually the pictures, and pictures in sequence, because as John was saying, it you can actually change the meaning of a complete thrust of a story by bringing in pictures out of context, which actually are not part of the essential story. Now that would be a shame. That would be a disaster. But the way to build up a good story in a visual medium like television, and surely in films, film, I mean, both documentary, which is sort of driven by facts, and also fiction, films, or rather feature films, which are largely fiction, is that the litmus test of it is that you place the pictures one after another without any sound, without anybody saying anything. And if people can make out, the audience can make out just by the sequence of pictures what the story is all about, then you are on. You've done your job. But if your sequencing of pictures, your sequencing of images go wrong, and it's not just what you have shot, what your camera person has shot, that's where the journalist or the filmmaker comes in. Is that the raw footage is like the big glass jar. It drops different elements, shards all over, and then you sort of craft it into a flowing narrative. That's where sequencing, or the right sequence, is extremely important, because the sequence of pictures must follow the sequence of the storyline that you are trying to build up. And if the two are not, if the two are in a bit of a mismatch, you have gone wrong. Your story is not told. You've actually ended up, you will end up confusing your audience. So it serves no purpose, because if audience comes out confused without understanding what you're trying to drive at, you're a bad storyteller. You're not in business. You're out. Um, in journalism or in filmmaking, or, fiction, non-fiction, whatever, whichever domain of storytelling, unless your sequencing of the essential elements, be it sound, be it film, be it images, if that's not in consonance with the flow of the story, the narrative, it doesn't work. One bumps into another, and there is a obvious dissonance. So, to sum up, transmedia storytelling is very challenging, and especially when you do it in different languages. Even in the same language, when you broadcast in, say, English in an Indian channel, and you do it for somebody like the BBC, it can be very, very different. You're doing it in the same language, the audience is different, the way you speak, many things actually have to be taken care of. And therefore, and I'm not talking of accents and stuff like that, but it's the focus, it's the sort of line that you take, the storyline. What makes a storyline that makes sense to an audience in India does not always make sense to somebody in Yorkshire. That doesn't work. So, an effective transmedia storyteller has to reconcile the gap between audiences, the gap between cultures, the gap between different languages in which the same story is being told, and of course, last but not the least, the gap or the difference between the different medium in which he or she is trying to tell the story. So when somebody like Liz Doucette or myself broadcast the same story in radio, line may be different. And for television, the way we start the story in radio and in television would be very, very different. Something maybe starting with sound effects, and something which starts with a video, but particular, sort of angle, um, wide to mid to close up, and then cutaways. So it all varies. So here, an effective, successful transmedia storyteller has to have, whichever original media he comes from, will have to have, by the time he becomes a transmedia storyteller, an effective command over the different medium in which he's trying to put the story out, the different audiences that he's trying to target. So, medium, the reality of the medium is important. The audience, the different cultures that you have to, the cultural barrier actually, you should transcend that. And last but not the least, retain the essence of the story. So you don't change the story for a British audience and for an Indian audience or for a Russian audience. The essential story has to remain the same. And that's where the challenge really is. Thank you very much. I'll just take a